Today's episode is brought to you by United Faith Leaders. Everyone should be able to find a faith leader when they need one. Find yours today at unitedfaithleaders.com. Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Coffee Pot Fellowship Podcast. My name is Jay McNeil, and our guest today is Micah Redding. Micah is the executive director of the Christian Transhumanist Association and the producer of its podcast. Micah is from many places, including Tulsa, Oklahoma, and lives in Nashville, Tennessee, where he is married and hopefully still celebrating his birthday from a week ago. Micah, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. Is there anything you want to add by way of introduction?
So that pretty much covers it. I've kind of lived all over. My family was pretty eclectic and spontaneous, and so we moved from place to place, and we lived in West Virginia, Seattle area, Ohio, Oregon. We just went back and forth throughout my entire childhood, and so I felt like I got a good kind of taste for the geographic differences and diversity of the world, and that's really given me I think a lot of the sense of what makes me what I'm interested in today, and what's kind of driven a lot of my interests. Yeah,
I definitely relate to some of that. My moving around a lot as an adult, I didn't do it in childhood, but as an adult I did every few years, a lot of times for education, and I was in the Army, and so bounced around a lot, but it helped me have a broader view, meeting people in a lot of different places, a lot of different stations in life, always having different jobs. So that's been really insightful. Yeah. All right. How about our coffee question? Micah, how do you like your coffee?
Yeah, well, so my friends would say I just like a lot of it, and that's generally the case. I drink both hot coffee and iced coffee, and all kinds of variants of those. But I think my kind of go-to favorite is I drink iced coffee with heavy whipping cream. And that is something that I don't know, I think most people are familiar with. Maybe put milk in your coffee, maybe put half and half in your coffee, but I take it all the way to heavy cream, heavy whipping cream. And once you go that way, you can't go back. So
yeah, it sort of defines what coffee's experience is, right? Once you've done that. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, cool. But it's always caffeinated, right?
For the most part, I have in my life just been mostly unaffected by caffeine. So I would just drink as much caffeinated beverages as possible. But, as I've gotten a little bit older, I've sometimes tried to, occasionally go for the decaf just to mix it up a little bit.
All right. Well, I do have to ask you, in case it doesn't come out in your stories, about Christian transhumanism, right?
Yeah.
I am going to put in our show notes, I've copied and pasted already, I think there are 5 statements about being a Christian transhumanist. But for our folks listening now, can you summarize what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Christian Transhumanist Association basically exists to try to create a better relationship between technology and religion, and to create these better conversations between kind of the billions of religious people in the world and the culture and the thinking that emerges out of Silicon Valley. And so we think, sometimes I say we're trying to create awkward conversations, because mostly those two groups of people are not talking. And so the Elon Musks who are trying to get us to Mars, and then the kind of rest of the religious world, I think those kinds of people need to be in conversation. So that's the starting point. And we try to articulate what it would mean for there to be a positive engagement, a positive relationship between those two streams of thought. And essentially, from a Christian perspective, we say, well, we believe that science and technology are among the means that God would want us to use to work to redeem the world, to work to help to do His work in the world. And so, I think a lot of times our cultures and our churches have this idea, the two responses to technology. One is kind of reactionary. Here's a new technology, it must be bad. And the other is to treat it as a consumerism. Here's a new technology, I'm just going to treat it like a new gadget, the new Apple Watch or something like that. It's a new fashion item, essentially. And I think those are insufficiently Christian responses. What we want to say is technology is not just something to react against. It's not just something that we can use as a fashion item. It's something that emerges from what it means to be a creative being made in the image of God. And when we realize that, then I think it gives us a healthier way to engage these conversations.
Thank you. And they're really short points. I mean, we're not talking about like chapters, right? So I've got 5 points. And I'll just go ahead and read a couple.
Sure.
So number 1 says, we believe that God's mission involves the transformation and renewal of creation, including humanity, and that we are called by Christ to participate in that mission, working against illness, hunger, oppression, injustice, and death. And I mean, I could read any of them. That's the longest one. Number 5 says, we believe that the intentional use of technology, coupled with following Christ, will empower us to become more human across the scope of what it means to be creatures in the image of God. In this way, we are Christian Transhumanists. And you've got a Facebook page and a website and this organization. And so I encourage folks to go check it out. I think if you've never heard of it before, right, as I had not, it sounds like, oh, here's some fringe folks out, just folks out on the edge. And I read that to say, you're really not. You're just embracing the technology, right?
Yeah. And
kindred Christians. Absolutely. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. It does sound strange, and we're okay with it being sounding a little wacky, but really what we're trying to do is to just try to have a better conversation from a really authentically and holistically Christian framework.
Right, and I was drawn to this because my ministry stuff embraces technology. And I am running into very, very often congregations and faith leaders that are resistant to technology, right? There's that first piece of, both of those pieces that you introduced at the beginning. But certainly it's technology, so I'm going to resist it because it's automatically bad.
Right.
And that isn't what you had said is an insufficient response. And I just want to echo that as good language. So that's all introductory. I'm going to move into some stories. So how about can you share a story with us that's a favorite? And this can be either one of your own or one that you've heard.
Yeah. So I think one of my experiences is that back in 2012, my brother and I had just kind of crashed out of some kind of a phase of our lives, and we're trying to maybe pivot and reorient ourselves. And so we took this round the world trip. We took 40 days and hit something like 14 different countries, and just were sleeping on people's couches and hostels and just kind of making our way. We didn't really have very much of a plan. We just hit these places and tried to survive. And so one of the places we ended up was actually in Egypt. And we had almost no real concept of what was happening in the world at the time. And so we were just walking around and taking the subways and so forth. And we randomly ended up emerging in the middle of Tahrir Square. And Tahrir Square was at that point in the aftermath of its big revolution, where they had just deposed this dictator, basically, and they were leading up to their first ever democratic election. They had never in their entire lives experienced a democratic election, and so they were trying to pull one together. And so Tahrir Square was full of thousands of people protesting and demonstrating day and night, just around the clock. And we had no idea. And so we emerged as, two Americans in the middle of this, and we're suddenly like, oh, I don't know if we're supposed to be here. I don't, there are really intimidating things going on. There are effigies being strung up in the square. We don't really understand. And so we just kind of tried to be inconspicuous, which was impossible, and people would kind of call us out and so forth, but they didn't bother us too much, and we ended up being there just inadvertently on the precise day that they announced the election, the results of their first Democratic election. And so I was sitting there as, we were standing in the square, thousands of people that had been going, full of noise and chaos around the clock. And suddenly for an entire hour, it just went dead silent as these people listened as the radio read off different numbers leading up to the election results. And I couldn't understand the language, so I had no idea what was happening or the moment that that they would actually kind of make the crucial announcement. But this whole square was silent, waiting, and then the numbers just kept kind of rolling out. And then finally, there was this moment where it went from dead silence and stillness, and then it erupted, and people were falling to the ground and jumping in the air and throwing each other up and dancing around and just it was just insanity, and people were crying and weeping for joy and all kinds of things. And I'd never been in as emotional setting as that. Like, I've never experienced that much emotion poured out in one place. And it occurred to me that these people had experienced something for the first time in their lives, and they'd gone from before having ever experienced a democratic election to afterwards, and I saw it, and I was profoundly affected by it, and I guess my takeaway, I noticed that there weren't really any camera crews out there visible, right? There were no big news papers or anything out there doing that kind of work. And maybe they were in the buildings or something like that. I don't know. But instead, everyone was capturing this with their own cell phones, their own little devices. And I thought, we're taking history, we're seeing history for the first time through the eyes of the people actually living it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You were definitely on the ground. I mean, literally.
Yeah.
I mean, pulled away at some distance.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a totally different experience, and history has always been recorded by the kind of people above the crowd, right? And for the first time, we're really capturing a little bit of what that experience is for people who are there and who are really, really having it.
Mm-hmm. Was the response, I don't want to say sort of monolithic, was everybody happy? I mean, everybody if it's a democratic election, right? Not everybody's candidate won, right?
Yeah. So the way that they explained it to me, and it was hard for me to, understand as an outsider, really, but many people said to me that they were not happy with the choices they had, right? The two choices they had were both bad from their perspective. And as kind of time played out, I think that's been the consensus, that the person that got elected, was ultimately deposed as well. But the other person who was running against him was also someone who had come from the old regime. And so they perceived that person as being just kind of another stand-in for the old guy, so to speak. And so I think a lot of people felt very conflicted because they weren't happy with the choice they had, but they wanted to have some kind of choice, And I think that's what a lot of it was that people were experiencing, is the feeling that they had really had some kind of choice and were able to make, a decision, even if it wasn't one that they were thrilled to make necessarily.
It is also worth noting that we are recording this on Election Day in 2017. So I went to the voting booth this morning and voted for governor and lieutenant governor and such. School board, things like that.
Yeah.
And I appreciate it a lot more. I mean, I think I appreciated it a lot in 2016, but I appreciated it a lot in 2017 as well. They were able to, in Egypt that day, at least block the most destructive, their perception of the most destructive of the two candidates, even if they weren't happy with the alternative. Yeah. Which I've heard some of those themes on my Facebook last night about the governor's race here in Virginia this year. They're not too excited about the Democratic candidate, but they're very scared of what the Republican candidate is about. So, elections. Thank you for this story.
Yeah.
Now, can you share with us this will be a more vulnerable point. Can you share a story of biggest trial or blunder from your life?
Yeah. So I think it's hard for a lot of people to see this, maybe because I'm kind of an unusual person and I've done some unusual things, but I'm also a very compliant person. And what that means is that in a lot of ways I empathize so much with people who are around me that it is easy for me just to get to absorb what they say so much that I find myself following their ideas, even when they kind of go against my own. And I don't sometimes realize that until, very far down the road. So that has played out in a lot of different cases, both small and big, humorous and not so much. One case that happened not that long ago, I was sitting in a Waffle House and talking to one of the waitresses, and we were having a good conversation. And before I realized it, she had signed me up to apply for a job at a Waffle House. I wasn't interested in a job at Waffle House at that moment, but somehow my openness to this conversation and my naivety going into it just allowed it to, I just went along with everything that came up until, I was basically applying for a job and getting phone calls and all this kind of stuff. So that's something I have to watch out for, because I will easily just kind of get sucked into something without realizing it. And, and that's happened on much bigger scales. A lot of what I think has happened, in my life is that sometimes I discovered some things, maybe when I was a teenager that really kind of resonated with me and became deep truths. And then later on, I read so much conventional wisdom, so to speak, that I took that conventional wisdom as being the truth and suppressed these realizations that I had. And in some ways that my 20s, were a way of kind of were a time when I absorbed a lot of just conventional truth, and I've had to come around later and say, wait, that wasn't for me. That wasn't actually truth as I perceive it. And that's, that takes some honesty and some kind of self-criticism. But that's where some of the biggest, I think, mistakes in my life have come from, is just kind of finding myself going along with conventional thinking without even realizing it.
Mm-hmm. I think that it does remind me of a lot of faith leaders do not perceive themselves, and it may be true for them, that they don't have the space to reanalyze their belief systems, especially that faith system, right? So if you're the pastor of a church congregation and you're having some sort of crisis of doubt, or you really want to chip away at something, or something's been chipping away at you, they have had to sort of toe the company line at the same time as they're having a crisis about that content, right?
Yeah.
And so it's very important for everybody, so faith leaders included, being able to have space to reanalyze the foundations, those pillars, all those pieces that help them get to where they are and what they believe. Yep. And I think it's kind of cool that, your Christianity is something that's clearly still in place, right? I mean, I'm reading all these points that talk about who Jesus is and who God is, right?
Yeah.
And so it's, as a fellow Christian, of course, that's encouraging. And I always want everybody to have their own integrity about their journey. And so having the space to say yes and no, like your yes can't be yes unless you have the permission to say no.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah, that's true.
Anyhow, I feel like that relates. I'm not sure if that was worthwhile.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, now we're going to turn the corner and ask our last story-based question. Is there a happiest life or ministry moment that you'd be willing to share with us?
Yeah, I think I think of this in kind of just general terms, but one of the things that for me is most significant about what I get to do, the conversations that I get to have, is being able to talk with people who you would not expect to be part of these conversations. So the conversations around religion and technology, you might have an idea about who would fit that, and in fact, so many people fit that. Because it impacts all of us. Mm-hmm. And I was actually just talking to a job recruiter the other day who, after we had a just kind of friendly conversation, he started talking to me about how he has a master's in religion and how he's really interested in all of these kinds of future technology issues. And we had this incredible big conversation about it from someone I wouldn't have ever expected to be interested in those things. But one of the groups of people that I find the most inspiring is the senior citizens, older people, because I think our stereotype is that older people are resistant to technology, right? But in so many cases, older people have a better perspective on what technology is, and I think a truer perspective, because we think of technology as something that came out in the last 2 years, the last 5 years, right?
Right.
But that's not technology. Technology is everything we've been doing for hundreds and thousands of years as humans. We've been building carriages and chariots and pencils and looms and all kinds of stuff. And so
right. I just came from the doctor, and I don't think we often think about medicine as technology, right?
Yeah, but it absolutely is, and it's incredible the number and amount of technologies that have come to bear on any kind of doctor's visit, right? Oh. And it's not necessarily things that we think of as just like high tech. It's everything from like Ziploc bags are an amazing technology. And I think so for someone who's older, who's lived through several generations, they have an awareness of that so many people don't. And so the conversations that I have with older people, with my grandmothers, I find that they're actually getting so much from these conversations that these are actually the kinds of things that they might have something real substantial to say, a perspective that they can give to the rest of us. And I think that's really valuable, and that's been one of the kind of most delightful things that I have experienced in this kind of work.
That's cool. I really enjoy talking with folks in the generations ahead of me as well.
Yeah.
As I talk about technology, and some people think that a lot of what I do is on the fringe, right? We're on a podcast, which is less and less fringy than it used to be. Right. But I'll admit to a tiny bit of surprise that the older generation, also, I think that what plays into their being able to try new ideas and think outside of the box and say things that you wouldn't normally say, like, I don't trust church. Like, it's coming from a pastor, you're like, what did you just say? They're like, I can't trust the church as far as I can throw it. I mean, like, you've worked in churches for 30 years. And just stuff like that. But they also, I think I don't know if there's a point that everybody gets to, but they're like, I just don't care what people think about me. I don't care what the consequences are. You can't hurt me. I'm like, I've lived this long and I've been through X, Y, and Z. There's just something in their freedom. They've like been liberated at age 65 or something. They're like, try and touch me. I'm going to say what I want. Don't presume to think that because I have gray hair that I fall into any certain category. I'm a wild child. And so that's been really exciting, encouraging, and like I said, just I think I'm more open-minded generally than most people. I'm sure I have some sort of ageism prejudices about me, but there's always a tiny bit of surprise that I'm like, that's awesome. I theorized that this was true, but you're rocking my world. Good.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. As we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to promote explicitly before we go?
Yeah, so I would just encourage people to check out the Christian Transhumanist Association, which is christiantranshumanism.org, and the Christian Transhumanist Podcast, which is christiantranshumanistpodcast.com. And so that's a place where I've just kind of open-ended conversations with different religious and technological thinkers, and you know, some of my friends as they kind of grapple with some of these things and their own process of questioning and reconstruction and so forth. So yeah, I'd encourage people to check that out.
Absolutely, and I am recommending the podcast as well, and you know, anything that you can do to plug in with Micah, it does sound like really interesting and fascinating stuff that he and his colleagues are up to.
Yeah.
Check it out.
Cool.
Micah, thanks for hanging out with us today. Really appreciate it. He and I know we had some scheduling challenges, but we've persevered. And we made this happen, and I appreciate his being here. And thanks to our listeners, as always, for tuning in, and thanks for living into who you are fully called to be. Today's episode was brought to you by United Faith Leaders. Everyone should be able to find a faith leader when you need one. Find yours today at unitedfaithleaders.com.